ahead, but the distant peaks in the horizon that sometimes we lose sight of. We'll hear the wise words of Elwin, Jessica, and Harsha, and Lee Maracle hopefully will be joining us shortly. And then we have a migrant strike detainee who's going to be calling us on the phone, so we'll see how we go as we move around in terms of time. Harsha also asked me to read a short segment, because I also wrote this thing. So I'll do that really quickly before you get to the main event. Okay. And first of all, thank you for asking to write in this. The roads to all the worlds we want to live in are not going to emerge from a single map, a single shift in cartography. They will be found in alleys and on little trails, found in the little struggles that we create, fight, and win. And at each step, we must mark our victories and our losses, learn, celebrate, mourn, and share. We must light torches. Groping in the dark, only knowing what the next 2 steps are, is not the way to fight. We must grow visionaries, cultivate our desires into plans, plans that last for years, even decades, plans that do not accumulate in one cyclic end, but rather ones that encompass many spikes and turns, plans that adjust to sudden shifts in terrain and survive overwhelming paradigm changes. We must understand that people act in a myriad of places: schools, shelters, food banks, health centers, housing projects, art galleries. Imagine spaces as much as material ones, gathering around music, shared stories, diverse identities. Our fights must be rooted in experience and in stories. People remember these more than sterile numbers or facts. Myths are powerful magic and can turn enemies into friends. In a world where too many still tell stories that some are illegal, and that to be free we must control the movement of others, the work of making new myths is essential. We have to write them, sing them, paint them, repeat them as they become imbued with the power of everyone who utters them. We have to ensure that our victories won are not slowly eroded, that our roots don't crumble underneath as we sit mesmerized by the fragrance of flowers on the trees. We must act with humility. We walk on paths chipped, act for centuries before us. We live in a world where what we know sits like one pebble on the shore of an ocean of what we don't know. We must act with respect. Respect for the lands, air, water, and all living beings. Respect to the indigenous people whose lands we live on. We must move with joy, joy snatched back from the most trying of times. We must have compassion for ourselves and for others. We must have honor, naming wrongs, accepting errors, asking for forgiveness, giving up egos towards accountability. We must act every day. We must act. And so in that mode of respecting our elders and honor what it is that has come before us, our first speaker today is going to be Jessica Danforth. Jessica is the Executive Director of the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, which is an organization by and for Indigenous youth that works across issues of sexual and reproductive justice, rights, health, rights, and justice throughout the United States and Canada. Nation are resistors of violence from the state, violence on the land, and violence on bodies. Restoration of knowledge, justice, and ways to be safer in communities is critical to their work. And yes, resistance is sexy. Harsha refers to Jessica's work in the very introduction to Undoing Border Imperialism, on sale for $15. And she quotes Jessica writing in 2009 as immigration enforcement attempted to arm themselves with Akwesasne. What the border has done so far to many of our First Nation communities is atrocious and horrific on so many levels. And it has poisoned our minds to think in singular factions instead of a full circle. We belong to Mother Earth, in whom no one has claim over, and where there aren't any borders. In that spirit, Jessica has a piece on identity and determination, laying out the complexities of place and struggle that she will share with us.
I want to first start also by thanking Hassan and thanking everyone for coming tonight, and really thanking you, Harsha, as a sister, as a mentor, as a friend, as a person who makes resistance very sexy. We said resistance is sexy because Harsha is sexy, so that's the new tagline that needs to be added. And I can't help but feel like, tonight in Harsha's pregnancy that we're joking that breast milk will fuel the revolution, but indeed it does. And when Harsha initially asked me to write, she asked me to write prose and poetry, and for those of you who know me, I am so not poetic, and I'm a super ranty, angry person, and I still am that person, but it actually was difficult for me, and it was a beautiful difficulty, and I want to thank you for that, because I need to try to find a way to express myself in different ways, and also feel like I can do something that I didn't think I could do. So I would never call myself a spoken word artist, and because of those of you who probably are spoken word artists, once you hear this, you'll be like, no, she's not a spoken word artist. So I would never claim that, but I'm sort of a closeted spoken word artist, but I actually don't like to say I'm coming out of the closet. I feel like I'm coming into the circle, and I think that in thinking about writing this piece, it is about borders, and Harsha spoke about, the communities and where my family is from, but we also need to think about the borders on our bodies, the borders on our gender, the borders on our identities. And that's really where I thought about writing this piece. And it isn't enough to talk just about land struggles without talking about body struggles. And the work that I'm constantly trying to do is where it isn't about picking one or the other, where we're not thinking of intersectionality as this new hot theory that some academic came up with that thinks that they invented shit. That's an indigenous worldview, or whatever you want to call it in English. And I think English is a super difficult language to operate in. And I couldn't, in trying to think about borders, and I, of course, know lots about them having grown up around that, but it isn't about picking one thing. It is about the self-determination to be who we are. And my grandma was the one who told me that the most indigenous thing you can do is be yourself. So that's where this comes from. Pick one, they said. North American, Indian, but wait, I'm from Toronto, although that's not where my family is from, and I don't live there anymore. Pick one, they said. Young, woman, but I'm not a woman like you might think I am. I'm two-spirit beyond the acronym of LGBT, and it's more than a sexuality. Pick one, they said. I work in sexual and reproductive health, but it's about rights and justice over body and space. Even if we didn't want to include environmental violence, we have to, since that's what's happening to us. Don't worry, I'm not interested in winning the oppression Olympics. I know I'm complicit too. But this isn't a two-sided story, since there aren't always two sides. There could just be the truth, the reality, the fact that there's a history to this continuing, the boxes, the borders, the lines being drawn. The refusal to accept that it's on purpose, the disguise that it's so much better than it used to be, while the roots remain too close for comfort. Now they say, we're inclusive, even though I'm not actually interested in being included, after I had to be included because I wasn't there to begin with. They're not looking at the center where I was erased, to uphold what makes it easier to not deal with. Now they say, I'm your ally, even though I ain't never seen them where I live. I don't remember being asked if that's what I want. There's this thing called free, prior, and informed consent, which doesn't seem to apply when it's about titles. Now they say, we'll get there someday. Even though the same patterns of oppression keep repeating themselves, I don't want to keep swallowing the pill of having to understand. It's only about a better policy. And it's not only about a better policy, law, or elected official. In the same system, it still hurts. Unless things are dismantled and just deconstructed where there's pain, regrounded and rebuilt where there's hope, it will still be messed up for some, always that same some, who never fit nicely into an equal opportunity. I filled applications, funding proposals, membership, and residency tests. The same organizations and groups won't call me. You're just too mixed, I'm told. But I don't feel mixed. I feel whole. And I'm not the only one. Every explanation I have to give because my story isn't shown in the mainstream. Every but I have to put in front of what I call myself in the English language. Every decision and discussion I have to get into because I will not allow my ancestors' struggles for me to be here to be silenced takes away my self-determination of identity. If you want to stop the us versus them, I just can't pick one.
We also want to present this tobacco as a gift. Thank you so much. So Elvin first lived and worked alongside migrant farm workers as a participant in the Frontier College Laborer Teacher Program in the summer of 2003. During that time, he met a number of undocumented workers from a number of different countries. 4 months after finishing the Laborer Teacher Program, he answered a classified ad in a Toronto Chinese language newspaper to work in a Leamington area greenhouse alongside other Chinese farm workers. He recounts part of that experience in Undoing Border Imperialism, on sale for $15, that he will share with us today. Elvin is also a freelance interactive and digital media producer, is currently working on the National Film Board interactive documentary telling the story of Herman Wallace, a member of the Angola Three, who until his recent passing was the longest serving US prisoner in solitary confinement.
Thanks, and thanks Harsha for including my story in the book. Something I realized when, after sending that bio to Hassan was that the reason that I actually started working with migrant workers through Frontier College was after a summer where I helped organize a march in Ottawa called No One Is Illegal, and that was in 2002. So it's amazing to see how far No One Is Illegal has come, and how it's leading to great things like this. I should have bookmarked my piece before. What page am I on? Here, I got it. Scanning the restaurant job classifieds in a Toronto Chinese daily late in 2003, I find the ad I'm looking for. Longzheng Tianyan. Zafan farm hiring, picking tomatoes. I call the number, and within a week I'm whisked down the highway to a greenhouse in southwestern Ontario. We're in the heart of the tomato industry. The conditions vary from farm to farm and greenhouse to greenhouse, but at this greenhouse, one of the region's biggest players, I know some specifics. In the summer, when the growers can bring in carefully selected, young, fit Mexican and Caribbean workers, they assign each of their workers personal digital assistants, measuring how quickly they work and ranking them compared to their colleagues. The living conditions are clean but cold and dehumanizing. In the winter, the growers and contractors play a different game. Some workers are picked up as early as 3 a.m. They wait, unpaid, until the workday starts at 6 a.m. At the end of the day, some may get to bed at midnight, sometimes as late as 1:30. Why so late? Between 10 and 20 farm workers live in a dwelling sharing one stove, fridge, and bathroom. Contractors pick up and drop off workers from and to scattered locales. Waiting dominates each day. When we're roused at 6 a.m., a pay dispute has already erupted. A worker tells me he hasn't been paid in more than 2 weeks. The contractor had promised payment on the arrival of our crew. Our driver would bring the cash from Toronto. Yet, here we were, no cash. 3 workers from his crew have already given up and left, forfeiting 2 weeks' worth of pay. The contractor drives 6 of us, 3 men, 3 women, to a smaller nearby greenhouse. 2 Bosnians work for the same contractor here. A Mexican Mennonite, and 2 Canadians are also at work, hired directly by the greenhouse owner. Everything we're working with is at floor level. After a row, I'm already aching. The greenhouse floor is covered with thick white plastic, and steam pipes run along alternating rows. We're warned to keep the plants from touching the pipes, but I slip on the wet plastic and bump into a pipe, receiving a slight burn. Employment is precarious. When a worker at another greenhouse is accused of taking a slightly longer afternoon break, he's barred from continuing work that day and forced to wait at the plant, unpaid, until the end of the workday to go home. I noticed some graffiti written in Chinese on one of the greenhouse bathroom stalls. It reads, translated, "Worked in this small town 2.5 days. Tasted sour, sweet, bitter, and heat. Looking to discover a bit of fortune, only to discover it's not here."
So on September 16th, about 2 months ago, we received word that 191 migrants who were in detention in Lindsay's maximum security prison had refused to enter their cells. As a result, the riot squad was called in and they were all beaten back and pushed in. The following day, all 191 detainees in 6 ranges in the same unit, but had somehow managed to communicate and initiated a 24-hour hunger strike. That strike ended, and then on September 23rd, all 191 detainees began a hunger strike again. And as I said, 2 of those people are still on strike, Linval Daly and Amin Majasiri. Since that time, we've been trying to communicate with the detainees and trying to develop a set of demands. And the primary concerns were initially about prison conditions, but they've slowly evolved around to a place where the detainees are asking for their freedom. The detainees are talking about how they've spent months after months, in some cases years, in these detention, where Canada cannot deport them or will not release them. These are detainees from places like Cuba, from Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, countries that do not issue travel documents, particularly because many of these migrants have been there, have been in the country 20, 30 years. In other cases, they're from Iraq and Syria, countries where Canada actually has a moratorium on their deportation. And even more, there are some detainees who are actually are refugees from those countries, so they can't actually be removed to them because their lives are at risk. Yet, unlike the United States, United Kingdom, and many other countries, the entire EU, Canada does not have a limit on how long people can be jailed. So people are in fact jailed indefinitely. And we've found it extremely hard to organize around these things, trying to stay in touch with people. People are calling us in the trap line, which is, because you can't actually call out, so people are calling us on collect onto systems. And then what we found is that people who were on hunger strike were put into maximum security prisons. Were put into segregation. Others were moved, so some detainees who were some of the key strike organizers were actually moved to other jails. And not only that, we were trying to communicate with people in the Toronto Immigration Holding Center, that's the detention center, the minimum security prison, and the people who were trying to organize the strike there have now been moved to Lindsay. In the face of this, initially the provincial government denied that there was anyone who was on hunger strike at all. Then they said there was 1, then they agreed that there was 4. The public safety minister has only made one statement, basically not even mentioning the strike, just saying we have to ensure Canada's security, etc. And so what that's meant is that people are on indefinite strike, and these are just the people in Ontario. Maximum security prisons in every province across the country has immigration detainees who are on indefinite hold, some for years. So the demands that have been coming from inside the prison that we've now been trying to communicate to others are simply an end to the end to maximum security hold, the end to indefinite detention, and basically the detainees are saying if you can't remove us, you have to release us. We have one of the key strike organizers we're going to be trying to get on the phone, but in the meantime, I'm going to pass this petition around. If people could please sign it. But most importantly, there's a column there that says, please, stay in touch if you want to be part of the campaign. We need your email addresses. We need you to be coming out to us, with us on the streets. There's a lot of people who say, basically, these people are prisoners, these are criminals. Why can we release them? There's this constant story that we're being told is that these migrants are threats to Canadian security. And none of these people have outstanding charges. They don't have any trials that they can go to. They are up for detention reviews that they can't actually get through. Okay. So DG is a Jamaican father who's been living in Canada. He lost his permanent residency due to a criminal conviction, and Canada has been trying to get a travel document for him since August of 2012. He's one of the strike organizers that started on September 2017, and has been active with the Black Inmates and Families Association. You can only do this if you're counsel. Max Scott is our great immigration counsel. We're actually filing at the United Nations for one of the detainees, and we're hoping to take a few other cases. We might have to go.
Hello, DG? Are you there? DG, are you there? We can try again in another minute. I haven't gotten through to a single client today.
Yeah.
And this will be my third call today. It's possible that they're actually blocking calls because they know that we're doing organized. Even though I'm counsel, they're not supposed to block my calls.
So we'll try again in 1 minute, and then what we have done is we've downloaded an audio statement by Amin Majasiri on day 26 of this hunger strike. So if we can't get through, you can at least hear from Amin, who his parents are currently about to launch a petition this week. Sorry. Hopefully in the meantime, Lee Miracle will join us.
To get through to me today too, and I didn't get through, and also Eric. Yeah, I think you may as well, because I don't think I'll try one last time. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, we just play another audio call. We have 15. So the reason is that we get 15 minutes within which to call. So if that person's not on the other end. Let's go out.
Hello, DG. Okay, I can hear something going on, so you may be there in a minute. Maybe Eric could cut the guard. Hello? DG? DG, you're here. Here you are. Hey, we're here. Hello. We're here. Hello, can you hear me? It's Matt.
Oh, what's up, man?
Not much, how are you?
Not too bad.
Okay, so you've got the statement that you wrote, right? There's a big room here. There's about 70, 80 people who want to hear what you have to say.
Okay.
So fire away, all right? Yeah, just go right ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to read a little thing.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I heard it. It's good. Thank you.
Okay. So you ready now?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Canadian immigration laws are broken. Their policies are close to impossible. It's like once you're in immigration hole, it's hard for you to get out. It's like once you're in immigration hole, it's hard for you to get out. As immigration detainees, we go in front of the immigration board every month, where they will tell us repeatedly that we're a fly risk and a danger to the public. They will continue to detain
So we're expecting Lee Miracle to join us. She's not here yet. So what I'll do is I'll ask Harsha to say a few words, and if Lee arrives, then maybe she can close with it. Is that okay? Okay. He took my phone. I'm about to. Mac.
There's also chairs here.
Yeah, and folks, please come on in. There's lots of seats. Say that he's coming. No, I mean, if Matt can bring the phone to the audio.
He's on the phone with another
Home with another detainees.
We can wait.
Did you just see the phone?
No, the audio phone's being downloaded onto my phone. Mac.
I had to actually talk to him.
Yeah. This is
You
how.
can't listen in on that.
Okay. I have this.
Thank you all. He's an amazing
Thank you.
guy.
Thank you.
their argument is the fact that they want to monitor us, right, in segregation. To me, though, maybe it's a speculation or an assumption to divide, but when we started the hunger strike, it was 180 of us plus. And then when the numbers dwindled, they started segregating a few. They say, oh, because of the length and the duration of the hunger strike, they want to monitor us, so they have us in segregation. And the irony is, in segregation, we went 6 days without being able to take a shower. We are unable to communicate using the phone. And our laundry basically has even got worse. Because we're getting punished without a misconduct or nothing. We just in here, just while we've been down here, I said 8 days, there was detainees here, how they say it, criminal detainees, pulling sprinklers and causing all kinds of havoc down here, and we are basically feeling the repercussions to their behavior. Okay, well, the reason for my hunger strike is the indefinite detention, the uncertainty of the outcome, whether it's going to be deportation or release. Yes, they're quick to acknowledge that detention is not indefinite, considering CBSA's diligence. They are working diligently on removing us. Although their diligence is kind of awkward, because getting a travel document and to deport someone should not be that difficult. It's either they recognize as a citizen or not. And depending on how long they have been detained for, they should play a major role, because what I found out about Immigration Canada is they claim it's not indefinite, although their immigration hold has no time duration. And they keep throwing case files that are very irrelevant to everybody's situation. As the saying goes, everyone's situation is unique. So my reason for the hunger strike is I'm detained indefinitely on an opinion, on a danger opinion, which only entitles them to deport, not lock me up and detain me indefinitely. There is a clause in the law that states you can detain someone indefinitely, and even then, if people come up for reviews to see if they should go on, because this is, how do you say, a judge and a crown that makes this decision. And second, flight risk. A flight risk for them is an assumption. You have to miss your flight to be considered a flight risk, not the fact that, oh, you could miss the flight and not show up. Besides, I believe the public minister, Vic told sometime, I may be wrong, I believe 2011, 2012, he made a comment about if you're a fugitive wanted for removal, you will be posted as most wanted in the media and the internet. So how can you assume somebody's a flight risk when you have a tool where it's funded by the government? You have a tool devised by the government to apprehend fugitives. So what's the purpose of that? But then you assume, and the people that we go in front of that make these decisions to detain us, they can go with hearsay from what CBSA says, and maybe it's because their hands are tied and it's their job. They have to answer to someone, but once again, God willing, this will get resolved sooner than later, because this is Canada, this is a democratic country. Yes, I have broken laws and I have paid for those. I've been punished for those. Immigration is not in a position to punish me. Immigration is punishing me right now. Because to them they say this is not a punishment. And what am I doing in a maximum security for 28 months? 28 months of my life. You cannot give that back to me. Even if you were to deport me right now, you could not give that back to me. There's a couple more of us you'll hear from. I'm not the only one. Oh man, for me, my hunger strike is that if you either deport me or you release me. Because this is ridiculous. This to them is basically me saying I'm comfortable. family right now, and by family I mean my immediate family, my wife and my son, are kind of estranged. And that's because I cannot see myself here being detained indefinitely and thinking about them. They will drive me crazy. So I have to keep it out of sight and out of mind. How inhumane is that I'm a father and a husband? Should I even be allowed to feel like this? But then, and that's another irony, for Immigration Canada, I'm a flight risk because I have a wife and a son. How does that make me a flight risk?
So that was a statement from Amin on day 26. We're now approaching day 60, and he's decided to continue his hunger strike and insists that he will do so until he's released. There's actually a few people who have been released who've been on hunger strike, but Amin isn't one of them. So now we've lost contact. As you all may know, Dr. Tariq Lobani and John Grayson, who were held in Egypt, actually went with us to Lindsay, to the correctional facility, and we were trying to get Tariq to visit Amin, and actually as a doctor to check him, because he'd started throwing up blood. As he said to you, he had lost 40 pounds, and that was some 30 days ago. But Tariq was denied access, and then following that, we haven't been able to stay in touch, and we haven't gotten a call, neither has the family. Okay. So, finally, I'm going to invite Harsha to say a few words. Harsha is someone who's inspired and been, an extremely motivating force in many of our lives. Sometimes rightly a chastising one in mine. Someone who I'm, happy to call a sister in struggle. So Harsha is a South Asian activist and writer based in Vancouver and ceded Coast Salish territory.
Thank you. Does anyone have Lee's coming? Okay. Okay. Thank you all for being here. I feel like getting up and just spending time hugging everybody. I would much rather do. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Mississauga, New Credit, and Haudenosaunee people. And I say that with deep respect and gratitude for those who have stewarded these lands far before most of us were here. And also I say it with deep gratitude because for most of my years when I lived with precarious status in Canada, actually the first people who took on that struggle with me and for me in many ways were Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. And when I was living in Montreal, it was Kanien'kehá:ka communities and Kanesatake and Kahnawake who first talked to me about borders and offered me various forms of sanctuary and status within those communities. And then further west with elders like Wolverine, the legendary political prisoner, Secwepemc political prisoner. And so for me, my struggles with status only actually ended a few years ago with the kind of formal Canadian state, but far before that was welcomed onto these lands by Indigenous peoples. And so for me, it's an obligation and a responsibility as well as a deep personal debt to keepers of these territories who have welcomed me here. So I say it from multiple places and mean it wholeheartedly. In terms of this book, I don't know how one launches a book, to be honest. And I'm not even really sure what people are interested in hearing about, but I do want to say that this book, for me, really is a collective kind of labor of writing and really of our collective movements, and it's a bit awkward to kind of have this book that you write, and maybe Jessica can kind of relate to that. I know she edited the very amazing book, Feminism for Real. But for me, the kind of most important part of this book has been the voices of so many people, many of whom are in this room, who are either in this book or who have influenced and who have mentored the kind of processes that have led to the creation of this book. So I really want to be explicit about that because we can tend to focus on individuals and our kind of accomplishments, if you will. But for me, this book really is a collective success. And so I really want to say thank you to all of you for all of the work that you've done and continue to do over the years that's influenced where I've been and this work. In terms of writing about border imperialism, for me it's both personal as well as movement-based. Both sides of my family have been displaced over centuries and decades, really. My mother's family is a product of the partition, and my father's family is also a product of basically colonization and the British Raj, where they grew up literally homeless in their own lands in the Himalayas and the northern part of India. And my mother's family is now on both sides of the colonially imposed border of India and Pakistan. And over that, since then, during that time, as well as and then subsequently in Punjab, the so-called Green Revolution, which really wasn't very green and wasn't really a revolution, was totally not green and a disaster, led to the displacement of, and continues to lead to the dispossession and destitution of farmers across Punjab. And so that was true for my mother's family as well as my father's family, but they weren't farmers, but from Shimla and Himachal. And so they've been forced into various forms. Particularly my father has lived as a migrant worker for most of his adult life, has been deported from countries for most of his adult life, and my father as well as myself have been in detention centers across the world in different places. So for me the struggle is deeply personal, as I know it is for many others, and it really is an honor to hear from people on the inside right now, and really send them so much respect for speaking out, because it's such a deeply isolating experience. And also, when we talk about displacement and dispossession, for me it's also personal because I spend a lot of my time in the downtown east side of Vancouver. For people who may not know, that's a community that's known as the poorest officer postal code in Canada. And most of the folks that I work with and love dearly and spend, 18 hours a day with, who are community and family, are folks who have been dispossessed from the land and who are in many ways struggling with very similar conditions of dispossession and displacement and deep trauma and heinous amounts of violence, particularly when we're talking about women, and particularly Indigenous women in the downtown east side. So these kinds of narratives of displacement and migration and dispossession really mark a lot of our lives. Even if we haven't directly experienced it, I think it's important to realize that the violence of border imperialism is one that marks all of us. When we're listening to stories about migrant workers picking food, this is the food that we eat. This is the food that is packaged by migrant workers and picked and stocked by migrant workers. So we have to really look at the ways in which we are globally and locally implicated in these processes. So I'll talk really briefly about what I kind of mean by border imperialism. It's a term that kind of just invented, but obviously the analysis is, a collective analysis and not one that I invented. But for me, border imperialism is a much more useful way of talking about struggles against displacement and migration, rather than just talking about, for example, immigrant rights, right? Because immigrant rights is kind of the mainstream narrative of how we understand these struggles. And what I think it does is it really domesticates the issue. It makes it one of whether the state should accept more immigrants or refugees, and whether immigrants or refugees are being treated fairly or poorly. That becomes the parameters and the constraints of those conversations, rather than a more systemic conversation around, well, why do we have these massive cycles of displacement and migration, and really violent cycles of displacement and migration happening globally? And these aren't a coincidence, right? When we look at these cycles, we can separate them really based on things like whether people are poor or rich, whether you come from rural centers or urban centers, whether you come from the global south or the north, whether you're indigenous or settler, right? Whether you're white or not white. There are very clear demarcating lines when we look at precarious migration. This, of course, stands in contrast to the kinds of narratives that are celebrated, like tourism or travel or exploring or discovery. This is not the majority of migration in the world, right? Most people can't afford vacations to Hawaii. So when we're talking about migration, we're looking at these really violent cycles of displacement and migration. And so border imperialism, I think, stands as in contrast to mainstream discourses of just talking about immigrant rights by forcing us to look at these kinds of systemic issues. Just to start off with by framing kind of what we're looking at in terms of the scope and scale of displacement. The International Organization for Migration as well as the UN estimate that there are 1 billion migrants across the world. Half of the world's refugees are women, and approximately 45% of forcibly displaced people are under the age of 18. According to figures published by the UNHCR, which is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, there are 43.7 million forcibly displaced people in the world, most of whom are internally displaced within their own countries. UN figures also reveal over 1 billion slum dwellers across the world, most of whom are internally displaced people from rural areas, people who are forced off their lands due to structural poverty and land grabs. And women are, of course, overrepresented in all of these statistics, right? So we're talking about people in the billions. And, I don't want to focus too much on stats because those can be overwhelming, but just to kind of illuminate with some examples, particularly right now, one of the fastest growing refugee populations in the world is that of climate refugees. According to stats by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, by the year 2020, there will be 50 million climate refugees all across the world, 50 million. And of course, this is, a group of people who are not even recognized, right? So Canada, for example, doesn't even recognize the category of climate or environmental refugees. And it comes with huge consequences. Pregnancy also makes me out of breath. So, do people hear about the show Border Security, the really awful racist show that came to light when there was a raid on a construction site? So we were working with a number of those families and folks who were detained in the raid, and a number of them are from Honduras. And one of the main reasons that 4 of them actually were displaced from their land in Honduras and ended up in Canada was actually because they were actually fighting a Goldcorp mine. Goldcorp is a Canadian giant, and they were fighting a Goldcorp mine in Honduras. But when they came to Canada, they couldn't say that because environmental refugees and climate refugees are not recognized by Canada. So we couldn't also talk about that experience, even though that was their experience, because they had to come up with a different narrative, if you will, of why they were seeking refuge in Canada, right? And of course, one of the ones that becomes an easy one to latch onto, because it fits into the war on drugs framework, is narco trafficking and the war on drugs. But that's the reality. So there are people in our communities who are displaced as a direct result of environmental degradation and disaster, and of course Canada's complicity within those disasters, right? Canada is a mining giant with over 75% of mining and exploration companies in the world being Canadian. And that's just one example. Of course, in the Philippines right now, because there's so much focus on the Philippines with the typhoon, it's important to note that in the Philippines, 8 out of 10 Filipinos have personally experienced the adverse effects of climate change in the last 3 years, right? So the current situation is not an anomaly. The Philippines is one of the most vulnerable island states to climate change, particularly being an island nation. But as a direct result of that, Canada, again, does not accept Filipinos to come into Canada as climate refugees. Instead, most Filipinos come to Canada under temporary worker visas, right? The most common one being the Live-in Caregiver program, where Filipino women come to work as nannies on temporary work visas to basically fulfill the need that mostly white rich women have in the domestic sphere to take care of their kids, right? So we have Filipino women coming in under the LCP as nannies, and increasingly Filipinos coming to work as temporary workers across the service industry. But again, not as climate refugees, with an acceptance and Canada taking responsibility for the reasons for why so many Filipinos are being displaced. And of course, it's not just climate-induced disasters in the Philippines, right? The Philippines has a long history, as other countries do, of things like Spanish colonization, U.S. militarization, World Bank imposed structural poverty. All of these kind of converge to mean that, particularly in the Philippines, for example, over 10% of the Filipino population is forced to work overseas. 1 out of every 10 Filipinos. So imagine the impact on the Filipino people, right? And the fact that particularly when we look at the LCP, that so many women are basically tending for and to other people's children, but are not actually able to be reunited with their own children, sometimes for 18, 19, 20 years, and what that creates. And this is important to highlight because, again, we see that within Canada what this means, because Canada right now is accepting more and more temporary workers and fewer permanent residents, right? This is really critical trends to highlight because it basically means that migrants are explicitly, by the state, being only as valued as the labor that they are able to provide, right? So once laborers are no longer needed by their employers, which is obviously huge in the context of austerity, right? Because in the context of austerity, we want people who are cheap labor, quick labor, disposable labor. People are able to provide cheap labor and then be disposed of as soon as the employers no longer need them. And conversely, it means that they are able to be cheap laborers because we don't have to pay, our employers don't have to pay full wages, right? Most temporary workers make less than minimum wage. They live in isolation with minimal access to social services. In the case of farm workers, for example, they pay into many tax regimes like EI, but can't actually claim them. So the state is actively making money off of their labor. And so this the cycle of precarity, and there's so many ways in which we can name that, right? Like unhealthy and dangerous working conditions as well as living conditions. Many workers literally living in massive labor camps. In BC, there's been a number of situations that have been exposed of really disgusting situations where workers are crammed into literally labor camps, right, with almost 20, 30 workers in a single room or sometimes in a few rooms. But all of these conditions, at the root of them is the fact that the denial of legal status for these workers means that they're in a constant position of precarity. So we have Western states being complicit in creating displacement in the first place, and then being complicit in forcing these workers in a life of perpetual displaceability, if you will, right? So this permanent precarity, kind of at all ends of the cycle. And also that, this isn't just the state, right? We're increasingly seeing unions being very hostile towards temporary workers. This happens within our movements as well and within the broader progressive left, if you will. So right now, unions are focused on abolishing temporary foreign worker programs from the standpoint of the impact on Canadian jobs and Canadian resources and what it means for Canadians, without actually actively supporting what the needs of migrant workers themselves are. And this is a long history in the labor movement. Of course, not all labor movement and not all unions, but the fact that there is this hostility, this deep nationalistic, patriotic hostility to migrant workers that continuously casts them as outsiders, as people who are not allegedly entitled and who are not supposed to be amongst us, right? This idea that they're stealing from us without any question about, again, whose resources are we talking about, whose lands are we talking about, and how was this all built in the first place, and on whose labor. And so this is something that we really have to be explicit about because we see these trends, again, happening within our movements. In BC, this is huge right now because temporary worker programs have really kind of ballooned since 2009. And we saw it most recently with HD mining, where there was such a backlash against Chinese migrant workers, and the union explicitly called for the revocation and the removal of all of the workers in the mine. And not from a perspective of, the mine being not environmentally sound, for example, but explicitly because those jobs were supposed to go to Canadians. And so a number of those workers were actually deported with the active facilitation of the union. I won't talk too much about other examples because I feel like most people know what's going on in the world in terms of immigration. But I do want to mention a few more examples because I think they're quite necessary. The situation in Afghanistan and Iraq, because these two are countries where Canada is directly implicated in war and occupation within Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. And of a staggering 4.7 million people displaced in Iraq and Afghanistan, the majority of refugees are crossing into countries such as Pakistan and Iran. And the U.S., which is, of course, again, directly implicated in the occupation of Afghanistan, accepted 328 refugees in the year 2009. And Canada, over the past 8 years, has accepted under 2,000 Afghan refugees. right? So this is a scale of devastation and then the scale of alleged responsibility that Western states are taking. And the flip side of that is, while we have the occupation of Afghanistan being justified in some circles, putatively under this rubric of women's liberation, right? This idea that we need to supposedly save Afghan women from Afghan men, particularly from the threat of Islam. In the context of Canada, what we're actually seeing is an increasing backlash against Muslim women, right? So on the one hand, we talk about globally cheerleading the liberation of Muslim women, which of course is a facade, but the hypocrisy is so clear when we look at the ways in which Canada particularly, not exclusively, but particularly, is dealing with the reality of Islamophobia. And there's a long history of this, but when we look right now in Quebec, for example, with the Charter of Values, there's been a noticeable spike of hate crimes against women who wear the hijab, for example. And again, important to note that a lot of these were happening in women's centers. So a number of women's centers held a press conference a month ago saying that within women's centers they were noticing hate crimes against Muslim women by other women accessing the women's centers. So we see the ways in which this rubric of feminism has been used against Muslim women, both locally as well as globally. And this is, of course, tied to the very basis of settler colonialism, right, which within Canada was explicitly designed to annihilate Indigenous nations by instilling a totally colonial patriarchal system, and that continues to have a particular impact on Indigenous women, and through the attempted devastation of Indigenous families and cultures and nationhood. The last thing I want to mention in terms of the impacts of border imperialism, so when we see the ways in which there's this limited inclusion of migrant bodies, is also looking at the ways in which migrant bodies are not only limited or included in limited ways, but are actively excluded. And we see that through, for example, incarceration, right? So in Canada right now, the fastest growing prison population is actually migrant detainees. And that's the same in the States, where the largest growing prison beds are going towards migrant detainees. And this is not a coincidence. This started in the United States, actually the year that NAFTA was implemented, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which led to one of the largest mass displacements of Mexicans in the first place. That same year so a lot of people know about NAFTA being implemented in 1994, a lot of people don't know that Operation Gatekeeper was actually implemented at the same time. And Operation Gatekeeper was the fortification of the U.S.-Mexican border, where millions and millions and millions of dollars went into fortifying the U.S. and Mexico border. And since then, over 6,000 migrants have died, and that's probably an underestimate. And according to Isabel Garcia, who works in Tucson, Arizona, she says, quote, "We never thought that we'd be in the business of helping to identify remains like in a war zone, and here we are." And so these are folks who are literally collecting skeletons of people at the border. And Mary Pat Brady, who also works at the border, describes border deaths as a, quote, kind of passive capital punishment, where immigrants have effectively been blamed for their own deaths, right? So this idea of that it's their own fault for crossing into highly patrolled regions. And on the Canary Islands, on the southern tip of Europe, where a lot of migrants, particularly from northwest of Africa, cross into Europe, it's estimated that 40% of migrants die every year trying to make that journey. 40%. That's an astonishing and disgusting number. And so again, we see that under border imperialism, the ways in which displacement and migration are manufactured is a direct result of Western colonialism and capitalism. And we also see how these migrations are then managed by Western states. So through, for example, the limited acceptance of refugees, the facilitating of migrants primarily to serve as cheap labor in the case of temporary migrant laborers, and full-out outright exclusion when we look at heavily patrolled borders and increasing rates of incarceration. So that's essentially kind of the framework of border imperialism, right, which is to look at it from this holistic framework. And when we're talking about criminalization of migration, of course, this isn't just limited to migrants, right? We're seeing the expansion of prisons that's affecting a number of different communities, Indigenous communities, sex workers, homeless folks, youth of color. and particularly women. We don't talk a lot about the incarceration of women, but in the U.S. as well as Canada, the incarceration of women has totally skyrocketed. In the States, the incarceration of women has increased by approximately 800%. And in Canada, the incarceration of Indigenous women has increased by over 90% in a decade, and been called even by federal conservative departments as an immediate crisis. Of course, they're not going to do anything about it, but we need to be looking at all the ways in which incarceration and the prison industrial complex is connected to the detention of migrants, and really all these so-called undesirables, right, that are being constructed. I wonder how much time do I have? Like 5 minutes?
Sure.
Don't tell me.
I think 5's good.
5's good? Is it 5? Have I been going on and on?
No, it's good.
I'll just super out of breath. I want to kind of like stop talking about what border imperialism is, because I feel like people totally know, and kind of leave it at that. But I want to end with talking about movement organizing, because that's what excites me more, and maybe excites you more too. And for me, the kind of exciting thing about this book is the fact that there's so many voices in it who are organizers and who are talking about organizing, who are talking about the different ways in which we resist, both in terms of the pieces that were read, which are amazing and brilliant, as well as a roundtable where people are talking about the ways in which we organize. So I don't really actually want to talk about No One Is Legal, because I feel like if people want to know about No, it's pretty easy to find out. So I don't want to talk about No One Is Legal as a movement. Is that okay? People probably know enough. But I do want to talk about lessons from No One Is Legal that I've drawn. And these are, going to be different for different people. And I want to talk about the lessons kind of as they apply to broader movements, and just end with that, and I'll be brief. In terms of organizing, I've been thinking a lot about it, as I'm sure others have, because we're in this incredibly exciting time where there's been a lot of inspiring movements, and then also times where we're struggling to figure out how do we move forward, because there's just so much going on. And so I have this kind of thing that the book is kind of hinged around, which is the idea of having movements be rooted in 4 basic principles, which sound kind of basic, but I know they're harder to do. So the first is the need for, so I'll just say them, so they're the need for movements to be rooted, relevant, responsible, and real, and what all of these things mean. So being rooted is the idea that we have to be rooted in root causes, right? So going back to this idea of border imperialism as one example, that we can't have movements that are not talking about root issues of injustice. And this is often a big thing, because we're often in debates about whether we need to be selling our movements to this kind of mythical middle of the road person, this totally mythical glob of white middle class men, and we're not really sure who they are or what they know, but we just believe that we have to do it. And so I want to say that I don't think that's really the way we should go, or should be going, and that being rooted means that we have to be rooted in root causes, so capitalism, colonialism, and oppression in particular, and being very rooted in these. And this isn't just a moral imperative. I think it's also, we can see that it's strategically deeply effective. If we look at movements that have inspired us of late, if we look at Idle No More, if we look at the Quebec student strike, if we look at the Arab Spring, if we look at the European-wide anti-austerity movements, if we look at BDS, these are all movements that have been clear and consistent in naming the root causes, right? Apartheid, colonialism, etc., capitalism, and have not shied away from these things. So I think being rooted means being very clear about that and not losing sight of that. Being rooted also means being rooted in communities that are on the front lines of the movements that we're fighting for, or alongside. And that means the idea, of course, of leadership, right? So being clear about where we're taking leadership from, and being clear that we're taking leadership from communities that are directly impacted. And that doesn't mean doing it tokenistically, and that doesn't mean simply accommodating people within our existing campaigns and groups and movements. It means totally decentering and unlearning some of the ways in which we might have been organizing, and instead allowing people to articulate their own needs and their own demands on their own terms, right? And that, I think, is a critical shift, because oftentimes we get stuck in kind of politics of representation and politics of accommodation, where as long as we have people fitting into our events and our campaigns, and we think that's enough. but I think it needs a radical restructuring of how we understand leadership, which is that people really need to be in the lead of the ways in which they're organizing and what that means. The second is being relevant, and being relevant is, I think, kind of tricky, because particularly when we're doing really radical transformative work, being relevant becomes hard because we feel like we can't really do things in the short term because it's all so long term and it's all so far away that we can't really be grounded in being relevant in the day-to-day, right? And there's so many examples, and people will have many, but I think being relevant is actually really necessary. It means being able to address where people are at in their day-to-day needs and being able to understand deeply what survival means for different communities, and that's not contradictory to long-term revolutionary change. In fact, it is part and parcel and necessary in order to advancing that struggle, right? And so I think being relevant is also acknowledging that we have to be effective. If we're not effective, then we're not really going to be relevant for people. And being effective means being able to meet people where their needs are. And sometimes that also is like a much trickier, larger question, but around how do we build alliances with broader communities, particularly those that we may agree with on some things, but we may not agree with on other things, right? So I know in my community, it's often hard in the South Asian community to be organizing. Because I'm like, all right, we're struggling, we're fighting against racism, we're dealing with this massive immigration backlash, but y'all are also really patriarchal and homophobic. And this is really hard. But that's the terrain of alliance building. That's the terrain of how do we do this work in ways where we meet people where they're at, but are also really clear about challenging things that are oppressive and doing that work in a way. And doing work necessitates being honest and calling people out, right? It doesn't mean being silent and tokenistic. It means that in order to be effective, we have to realize we're in this together, and we have to be figuring out how we're going to do this at multiple levels. I'm going to rush through this. Being responsible, I think primarily, I think in particular means being responsible to struggles that are anti-colonial and are against settler colonialism. I think that's really at the core of, a lot of what I spend my time doing, but I'm not going to have time kind of talking about. But really being responsible to Indigenous nations and Indigenous nationhood, and really understanding all the ways in which we're complicit in the ongoing settler colonialism of these lands, and understanding that anti-colonial struggles are of a wide range, right? It's land defense, it's reproductive justice, as Jessica was talking about, it's violence against women, it's so many layers of struggle, and really being alongside and understanding our obligation to that struggle and how that is really foundational to all of our movements. And so for me, a big piece of migrant justice organizing has been how do we as migrants, particularly folks of color, understand our responsibilities to Indigenous nations, and what are the ways in which we have those conversations and build those alliances, and do that work in a good way, in a way that learns with each other. Being real, final thing. Being real is hard, because a lot of it is about our internal shit. And the ways in which we organize internally. And I think there's a lot around that, right? There's the need for us to really build our movements in ways that are sustainable. We have to be honest about the fact that our movements aren't really sustainable. They're not really intergenerational. Folks, bounce out of the movement at a certain age because we're not able to really tend to the fact that we're not looking at things like how do we build intergenerational movements that honor youth and elders, that honor parents and folks who do childcare or otherwise involved in care work. How do we build communities of care in general so that people feel that if they're struggling, they don't have to be out of the movement in order to have those needs met, but rather that the movement itself is something that sustains us, right, rather than burns us out. I mean, the fact that if organizing burns us out is just like totally illogical to me. Like, I feel so grateful and lucky to be in movements where I feel sustained, but the fact that for the majority of folks our movements are things that burn us out is totally detrimental and totally the opposite of what we're trying to build, right? And also just getting rid of this idea, I just want to say one last thing on this, is getting rid of this idea that we don't have leaders. Like, I'm kind of sick of that idea that we don't have leaders. We need to be real about all of us being leaders and building people's skills and ability to actually be leaders. Because when we pretend that our movement has no leaders, we just end up dragging everybody down rather than lifting everybody up, right? And that really means centering the notion of abundance, that we don't need to compete over space, We don't need to compete over resources. We don't need to compete over who's better or who's not, right? We need to really be lifting each other up in the spirit of we all have a role, we all have a space, we all have something to offer, and we all have skills that we can teach each other, right? And be intentional about the ways in which we're building with each other. And so I just want to end by saying that for me, being in movement and being in community has been a gift. It's through the movement organizing that I've been able to kind of learn a lot of these different things. And even though I may not know some of you personally, I know a lot of you personally. It's been through this kind of mutual process of learning and sharing, where for me, movement organizing has been something that's been so deeply empowering. And for me, what I hope this book does, and what more importantly your movements do, is have the ability to actually lift all of us up and empower all of us, rather than bring us down. Because I think we go through spurts where we're really inspired, but in general, our movements are draining us. And I think that's kind of one of our biggest challenges. And how do we find and nourish our sense of purpose in this work, particularly our spiritual sense of purpose in this work? I think is really imperative. And so I want to thank all of you, because all of you are very much nourishing to the soul and the spirit. So thank you.
So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. We're going to, so there's a couple of quick announcements. One is there's 8 books left, so please grab them as you go out. There are also posters that are available for sale that the Radical Design Collective has made, and there's a petition going around that we really encourage you to sign. So what we'd like you to do is for you to stick around, have conversations with each other, build relationships rather than it just being a back and forth. I know Harsha is going to be coming around giving you all hugs, so you should get in on that. So thank you so much for coming. Please stay in touch with the various movements that are in the city. And thank you again to the speakers. Great, what is it?
Because the crow, I think we're done now. Came out good.